Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is migrants and migrations. The lecture seeks to locate the contemporary debates on migration. To do this, we hold the figure of the migrant centrally and we explore issues, patterns and concerns in the discourse on migration. The main objectives of our today's lecture are: number 1, to explore various meanings attached to migration; number 2, to locate migrants in the discourse on migration; number 3, to understand refugees, refugee flows and the associated politics. At the end of this lecture, the expected outcomes in line with objectives are: number 1, development of an overview on key debates on migration; number 2, awareness on migrants, migrant classifications, typologies and issues; number 3, development of basic understandings on issues linked to refugees, refugee flows, refugee identity, international legal frameworks and politics on refugees. First of all, we will discuss what migration means. The first section is based on the first objective, that is to explore various meanings attached to migration. We begin by looking at various definitions of migration, starting from the simplest dictionary definitions to debates on migration in the larger body of academic work identified as migration studies. Simply put, migration or human migration is a change of residence or a movement from one place to another for an individual or a group. As per Castles, migration refers to the crossing of a boundary of an administrative or a political unit. He further elaborates that migration is becoming increasingly common as people move in search of security and better livelihood, from villages to towns, from one region to another in the home country, or between countries and continents. International Organization for Migration, or IOM, defines migration as the movement of a person or a group of persons, either across an international border or within a state. It is a population movement encompassing any kind of movement of people, whatever its length, composition and cause. This includes migration of economic migrants, refugees, displaced persons and persons moving for countless purposes. Gathering from all these definitions, it is clear that migration may be defined as a process which involves moving across a border or within a state, but it is not limited to this. Following from Castles, we observe that migration relates deeply to social and economic contexts. It may emerge from particular developmental contexts or may contribute to development and improved economic conditions, or alternatively, it may perpetuate inequality for certain groups. All these complex interactions of migration with particular contexts are mediated through a number of factors, like the character and patterns of migrations, policies of governments, the reception by host societies, the macroeconomic conditions, legal frameworks, citizenship rules, etc. Also, as a process, migration is deeply linked to processes of globalization, territoriality and cultural change, and it intersects issues linked to ethnic identities, nationalisms, borders, conflicts, etc. Within these interlinked and intersecting processes, migration comes to have a profound complexity. Peter Burgess attests to these complexities when he states, and I quote, "It is a concept of out-of-placeness, a concept of change, evolution and modernization. It is a concept of historical phases. It links notions of connectedness, belonging, identity, place and space." While as we realize that migration is a complex process, there have nevertheless been attempts to classify various forms and types of migration. Within most of these classifications, two dimensions which are clearly identified are distance and time. Simplistically speaking, migration involves covering of a distance from one place to another, often across a spatial boundary, over a period of time or from a specified time. But these two dimensions alone do not reflect the complexity of the process, and there is no rigid way to explore migration. We will explore some of the varied types of migration in the following classifications. To start with, we explore a classification based on crossing of territorial borders and the associated terms like international migration and internal migration. International migration refers to crossing a state's borders. Placed within this migration, we have transnational movements of people for livelihoods, education, security, etc. The migration of people from South Asian countries like India, Bangladesh, etc. to countries in developed world for livelihoods or for education is an example for international migration. This often involves crossing border controls, coming in interaction with immigration institutions of various countries, and using formal means of transport. However, this is not to limit our understanding, as refugee movements may also fall within this type of migration. Political classifications and identifications associated with this term include migration management, emigration and immigration, naturalization, remittances, etc. Migration management encompasses numerous governmental functions with a national system for orderly management of cross-border migration, like managing the entry and presence of migrants within the borders of a state. Migration management includes planned approaches to the development of policy as well as legislative and administrative responses to key migration issues. Emigration refers to processes and actions associated with leaving a country of origin, and emigration refers to processes and actions linked to entry in a country. Associated terms include brain drain and brain gain. Brain drain refers to the migration of qualified and trained people from one country to another, particularly from a developing to a developed country. Brain gain is the reverse of the same. Brain drain is a key problem in many developing countries including India, as it adversely affects the quality of human capital, knowledge production and development. Remittances refer to the money transferred by migrant workers back to family members and acquaintances in their countries of origin. India is the largest recipient of remittances in the world, with more than $69 billion received in 2017. Most of these remittances for India originate from Gulf countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc., followed by US, UK, etc. Naturalization refers to granting of citizenship by a state of its nationality to a non-national through a formal act on the application of individual consent. Another term which has gained a lot of traction in discourses on international migration is diaspora. Used here as coterminous with transnational communities, diaspora refers to migrants or descendants of migrants whose identity and sense of belonging have been shaped by their migration experience and background. Related to diaspora is a strong sense of longing for the homeland and the homeland's location in the collective memory. Many different types of diaspora have been identified. These include victim diasporas, labor and imperial diasporas, trade diasporas, cultural diasporas, etc. Indian diaspora has been recognized as one of the largest and most diverse in the world. Internal migration. Internal migration refers to a move from one province, district, village, region to a city or a region within a country. The migration of informal labor migrants from North Indian states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar to cities like Kolkata, Delhi, Bombay, etc. for engagement in a number of sectors like construction, domestic work, etc. is an example in this regard. We will be taking up a more detailed discussion of internal migrants, particularly the informal labor migrants, in the following sections. But before we proceed further, we must reiterate that rigid distinctions between different migration types, patterns, typologies or concerns are difficult. For example, international movements can also be over short distances and without stiff border controls. People cross borders with little opposition in countries of European Union or between some countries in Southeast Asia. In contrast to this, internal migration may be over large distances. And despite the absence of physical borders, there may be oppositions based in ethnicity, religion or race. For example, migrants from North Indian states like UP or Bihar travel long distances to metropolitan cities in India. Even in this case, there may be some political parties who base their appeal on an anti-immigrant rhetoric. Also, not all border crossings are classified as migration. For example, in case of daily movement to work between Sweden and Denmark, or tourism or pilgrimage related travel. Depending on the context, migration often involves taking up residence for a particular period of time, which brings us into the temporal element vis-a-vis the country context. For example, for international migration, visas may be granted based on the duration of the visit and the associated classifications by governments like short-term, temporary, long-term and so on. Following from Castles, we observe that such variations highlight the fact that there is nothing objective about definitions of migration and that they are the result of state policies introduced in response to political and economic goals and public attitude. Having given an overview of national and international migrations, we go into other classifications. Classified chronologically, like temporary migration, permanent migration, and undetermined. Within temporary migration, migrations may be further identified as contract or seasonal. There may be classifications based on causal factors or push or pull factors as they have been referred to in elementary migration discourse. Push factors may include lack of jobs, economic and cultural contexts, armed conflicts, disasters, etc. Pull factors may include better prospects for jobs and education, security, etc. Related to these are ways to classify migration as voluntary or involuntary. However, migration is much more complex, and so are the economic, social, and political factors which intertwine with migration processes. Push and pull factors and matters related to will of a person to change, move, depending on a person's or a group's location vis-a-vis social class, religion, ethnicity, age, physical ability, individual choices alongside structural realities, etc. In any case, there are hundreds of ways to define and classify this complex phenomena due to the scale of the migration flows, the diversity, as well as the varied migration experience. Today, there are a number of specialized interdisciplinary theoretical and methodological approaches to study migration in fields like migration studies, forced migration studies, critical migration studies, etc. It is as Peter Burgess states, migration is one of the great global dramas of our times. Such numbers surpass, like many global phenomena, the scale and scope of our experience, our expectations, even our imagination. The second section. This section is based on the second learning objective, that is, to locate migrants on the discourse on migration. As per UN and World Bank estimates, there were more than 266 million international migrants in 2017. More than 16.4 million international migrants among these are from India, which makes India the largest origin country for international migrants. Among South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Afghanistan also figure among the top 10 origin or source countries for international migrants. These figures are indicative of the migrants who undergo international migration. Estimates for internal migrants are difficult due to the scale involved. As per various reports, more than 139 million people qualify as migrants alone in India. This number largely attempts to estimate migrants on the basis of labour. However, this number increases manifold when other types of migrations may be factored in. So much so that as per some reports, every 1 in 3 Indians is placed as a migrant, intrastate or interstate. Related to this scale, as well as placed in the complexities of defining migration, there are a number of ways of defining a migrant. Many commonplace definitions of the migrant emphasize the free will and the economic dimensions, where the decision to migrate is taken freely by the individual concerned. For International Labour Organization or ILO, the term migrant relates to those who are currently employed or unemployed and seeking employment in their present country of residence. However, some of the more developed definitions, like the one provided by International Organization for Migration, recognize the profound complexities involved and defines a migrant as any person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state, away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of the person's legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the cause for the movement are, or what the length of the stay is. Placed thus and based in the varied classification of migration, there are a number of ways to designate migrants, including labour migrants, economic migrants, environmental migrants, political migrants, illegal migrants, undocumented migrants, unauthorized migrants, seasonal migrant, etc. In most cases, there can be no neat categorizations, and these are often intersecting depending on the context involved. Here, it may not be possible to detail issues and challenges faced by different types of migrants, and we limit ourselves to the case of informal labour migrants in India and their key problems. Rural migrant workers in urban India, estimated at more than 120 million, form a backbone of processes linked to economic growth and urbanization. These informal migrants experience informal labour arrangements with low wages, long working hours, exploitative and unsafe working conditions, denial of basic services, etc. This applies particularly to the seasonal migrants in sectors like construction, hotel, textile, manufacturing services, etc. Most migrants in the informal sector in the developed world, but particularly in the developing countries, have limited access to quality housing. In most cases, they may live in substandard housing in slums with limited access to water, electricity, cooking fuel, etc. These housing sites include slums, open spaces, congested rented apartments, payments, work sites, etc. Most migrant workers in the informal sector have very limited access to health care. This is linked to income and food insecurities, poor housing conditions, hazardous occupational conditions, discrimination, lack of support networks, low level of awareness, as well as the increased cost of health care. These factors lead to highly increased vulnerabilities to both infectious and non-infectious diseases and health conditions. Prominent problems relate to high incidence and morbidity due to HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, problems related to sexual and reproductive health, occupational health, etc. The marginalizations faced by migrants, particularly in the informal sector, may be intensified by politics at the destination linked to identities like religious, ethnic, regional, gender, racial, etc. We have seen examples in India and across the world when large number of migrants had to flee due to incidents of violence directed against them. Also, increasingly, many political actors may deploy a forceful political rhetoric against the migrants and position them as a threat to the citizen. There is often a remarkable invisibility of these migrants when it comes to recognition, rights, and basic entitlements as compared to the citizens. Often, they remain at the margins of debates in governance, policy, and intervention. The common issues faced are linked to non-payment of wages, accidents, etc., but state institutions are hardly sensitive to their issues. Most informal sector migrants enter the job market at a very early age and remain stuck in unskilled, poorly paid jobs for their entire lives with very little upward mobility. It is important to note here that the issues mentioned here pertain specifically to informal sector migrants, particularly to the Indian context. But many of these observations, like vulnerabilities linked to poor housing and healthcare, relate to other migrants too and may become more pronounced, like in the case of refugees and stateless populations. The third section. This section is based on the third learning objective, that is to understand refugees, refugee flows and the associated politics. Before we go into the contemporary issues and challenges vis-à-vis refugees and refugee flows, we will familiarize ourselves with key debates on who is a refugee. As per UN Convention on Refugees of 1951, a refugee is a person residing outside his or her country of nationality who is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. The Convention codifies rights of refugees, and the core principle asserts that refugees should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. This is now considered as a rule of customary international law. Signatories to the Convention, around 141 countries, undertake to protect refugees by allowing them to enter and granting temporary or permanent residence status. The United Nations Refugee Agency under United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees or UNHCR serves as the guardian of the 1951 Convention and the following protocols like the 1967 Protocol. As per the UNHCR reports, there were more than 68.5 million persons who are forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict and generalized violence. As per updates in 2018, this number has increased to 71.44 million. Out of these, more than 19 million have been recognized as refugees. Around 3 million are categorized as asylum seekers. More than 39 million are classified as IDPs or internally displaced people. More than 4 million as returned refugees and around 2.7 million as stateless persons. These terms like IDPs, stateless persons, asylum seekers point us towards the complexity of the discourse on forced migration. To simplify some of these discourses, we will briefly go over UNHCR definitions of these terms. We have already visited a definition of refugee. Taking this further, as per UNHCR definitions, refugees include individuals recognized under the 1951 Convention and the statutes relating to the status of refugees, its 1967 Protocol, the 1969 Convention, etc. These individuals are granted temporary forms of protection. A vital part of being recognized as a refugee is refugee status determination, a legal process that governments or UNHCR use to determine whether a person seeking international protection is considered a refugee under international, national law or regional law. The process can be lengthy, complicated, and is certainly imperfect. Asylum seekers are individuals who have sought international protection and whose claims for refugee status have not yet been determined, irrespective of when they may have been lodged. Internally displaced persons are people or groups of individuals who have been forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters, and who have not crossed an international border. Returned refugees are former refugees who have returned to their country of origin spontaneously or in an organized fashion, but are yet to be fully integrated. Such return would normally only take place in conditions of safety and dignity. As per UNHCR, stateless persons are defined under international law as persons who are not considered as nationals by any state under the operation of its law. In other words, they do not possess the nationality of any state. Examples include Rohingyas in South Asia. Migrants and refugees, definitional issues. What has been clear across all these distinctions is the element of force, forced migration, forced displacement. Revisiting the definition of the migrant, we observe that many definitions observe that a migrant, in distinction to a refugee, is one whose decision to migrate is taken freely for reasons of personal convenience and without intervention of an external compelling factor. However, there persists a number of problems with such conceptualizations. The matter of choice or free will of a migrant is sometimes extremely constrained. There are many grey areas where the legal demarcations may not work, and as Amartya Sen points out, that it is no coincidence that the so-called economic migrants are often escaping repressive regimes. Conversely, some countries or dominant political and media discourse within countries would be uncomfortable with the use of the word refugee because of the associated responsibility of care, and would instead refer to refugees in terms of migrants, economic migrants or illegal migrants. This is visible in some of the findings of UNHCR reports dealing with mainstream press coverage of refugee flows. The report observes that press in Germany and Sweden overwhelmingly use the term refugee or asylum seeker, a moral and empathetic categorization, while as press in Italy and especially UK use the word migrant, with the word immigrant popular in Spain. Creation of refugee crises. Associated to use of such labels is the creation of a frame of crisis and in its normalization to explain refugee flows in the world today. I will give examples from the so-called European refugee crisis and then move towards attempts at positioning a crisis in India over movement of Rohingya refugees. At the outset, I make it clear that the idea of these crises is not placed in the experience of the refugee. This is not a crisis for and of the refugee, but rather these are explained as crises for the host societies and states. In a study I conducted with Manish Jha, we argue that the European refugee crisis is created in reiterating the entry of refugees into Europe, and an impression is given that some European countries struggle with this flow, as if these countries are in an unprecedented struggle to cope with the influx. This not only plays up statistics as spectacles but conceals much larger flows into Turkey, Jordan and other countries. Within this idea of crisis, politicians and media then associate metaphors like tides, swarms and tsunamis of refugees, which is then linked to images of thousands of alien boats entering European seas and refugees setting foot on European territory. This creates an impression of the crisis and threat to the idea of Europe, as if the civilized Europe was bursting at seams with the entry of 1 million migrants. As per Ranbir Samadar, this crisis is only reinforced due to the idea that most of these refugees are non-Europeans, Muslims and non-white. This crisis also associates refugees and refugee pathways to violence, terror and crime. The functionality of such an association with criminality, terror and sexual offence is directed to create political pressure against refugee migration. The reiteration of these themes creates a discursive sphere where elite political actors seek to reorient their messages to meet the violent imaginaries and panics created in media discourse. Mediated in political messages which call for actions to satiate the fears and placate the domestic political pressures, such association of refugees with criminality and violence instrumentalizes the imagery of fear and threat. This then feeds into legitimization for actions against the refugees, particularly with regards to tightening of controls and increase in surveillance. This is no longer limited to countries of the north, and we increasingly see deployments of crisis to explain refugee flows even in the developing world. For example, in case of movement of Rohingya refugees fleeing persecution in Myanmar. This was not the case when India received hundreds of thousands of refugees from Bangladesh during the 1971 war, or in the case of reception of thousands of Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka fleeing civil war. However, the entry of a mere 30 to 40,000 Rohingya asylum seekers has been positioned as a crisis. Increasingly, they have been presented as a threat. Their refugeehood has been placed in doubt, and the discourse over Rohingya has been understood in terms of security and populist political rhetoric against their entry. However, this is not to argue that everyone in these countries and contexts is opposed to the condition of people fleeing war and destruction. A number of individuals, activists, academics, civil society organizations, etc. have been vocal in their opposition to anti-refugee politics and have gone out of way to help in the humanitarian effort. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Till then, take very good care of yourself. Thank you for watching.